The sterile scent of antiseptic and lilies filled the private hospital suite, a strange perfume for a room where a king lay sleeping. Clara Bennett adjusted the crisp white sheet over her patient's chest with practiced, gentle hands. She had done this 1,000 times in the past 4 months. And in 4 months, Julian Vance had not opened his eyes. Once, but she still spoke to him. "Good morning, Julian," she whispered, her voice as soft as the winter light filtering through the enormous windows. "The weather's turning cold today. I brought you fresh peonies. I know the lilies are traditional, but you always struck me as more of a peony sort of man." Silence. Only the steady, patient beep of the heart monitor answered her. That and the low hum of machines that were keeping the most powerful man on the eastern seaboard tethered to this world. Clara smiled to herself, a small, sad smile, and moved to the vase by the window. But she was a large woman, plus size in every sense the world used to make her feel smaller. She had a full, round face, a soft double chin that dimpled when she smiled, heavy arms that were always warm when she held a frightened patient's hand, and a wide, generous body that filled her pale blue scrubs. Her dark hair was pulled back into a low, neat bun, and her cheeks always carried a natural flush. She was, by every measure, the elite Vance Memorial Hospital used to judge its staff. Invisible. Except to him. She sometimes wondered if he could hear her. "Your board meeting is at 10, she continued, arranging the peonies with careful attention. "I overheard the security men talking. Something about the merger with the Kensington Group. I don't understand any of it, of course. I just thought you should know." Julian Vance lay perfectly still. His face, even in a coma, was impossibly handsome. All sharp angles and severe planes. His dark hair was longer than it had been the day he was brought in after the car accident, and there was a slight shadow along his jaw that Clara had asked the attending physician to leave alone. She thought he would prefer it that way. She was, after all, only his nurse. The door of the suite hissed open without a knock. Clara flinched, a habit that had become instinct. The woman who swept into the room was everything Clara was not. Tall, impossibly thin, wrapped in a cream cashmere coat that probably cost more than Clara's yearly salary. Her blonde hair was blown out in glossy waves, and her lips were painted a shade of red so bold it looked like a wound. Victoria Kensington. Julian Vance's fiancée. Or, more accurately, the woman who claimed to be his fiancée. The engagement had been announced 3 weeks before the accident. There had been no ring on his finger when he was brought in. Clara had noted that, quietly, the way she noted everything. "You," Victoria said, her ice-blue eyes flicking over Clara with visible distaste. "Why are you still here?" "I said I would be visiting at 10. "It's only 9:15, Miss Kensington," Clara said gently, folding her hands in front of her. "I was just finishing his morning care." "His morning care." Victoria's laugh was sharp and unkind. "God! Listen to yourself. You speak as if you're his wife." Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she said nothing. She had learned, long ago, that arguing with women like Victoria Kensington only fed them. Victoria's eyes narrowed. She stepped further into the room, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and stopped at the foot of Julian's bed. She did not look at him. She looked at Clara. "Let me be very clear, sweetheart," Victoria purred, though the word held no sweetness. "You are the help. You empty bedpans. You change sheets. You are paid, by my future family, to be here. Nothing more. I understand my role, Miss Kensington. Do you?" Victoria's gaze slid over Clara's body. That slow, calculated once-over that women like her used as a weapon. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've gotten quite comfortable. Talking to him, fluffing his pillows, bringing him flowers. She reached out and, with one manicured finger, plucked a single peony from the vase. She held it up, studied it, and then let it drop to the floor. Deliberately. "Peonies," she said. "How rustic, how very you." Clara bent quietly, and picked up the flower. Her hands were steady though her heart was not. "He always seemed to like them," she said softly. Victoria laughed again. It was a terrible sound, high and thin. "He likes them, he likes them. Do you hear yourself, girl? You are a nurse, a hired body in scrubs. He does not know you exist. He would not know you if he woke up this very second. Do you understand?" The words landed exactly where they were meant to land. Clara's throat tightened, but she kept her face composed. She had spent 31 years learning how to keep her face composed. "I understand," Clara said. "Good. Now, get out. I want a private moment with my fiancé." Clara nodded. She placed the rescued peony back in the vase with quiet dignity, gathered her chart and moved toward the door. Behind her, she heard Victoria sigh, a bored, theatrical sound, and mutter something about needing a stiff drink after this. Clara did not look back. She did not see the twitch, the smallest, almost imperceptible movement of Julian Vance's left index finger against the white sheet. But someone else did. In a room, 3 floors below, the wing of the hospital that officially did not exist on any blueprint, a man in a charcoal suit leaned forward in his chair. Marcus Cole, Julian Vance's oldest friend and second in command, watched the live feed from the suite with narrow, dark eyes. He had been watching this feed for 4 months. He tapped a single key on his tablet. The heart monitor in Julian's suite, which had been beeping in a slow, sleeping rhythm, shifted. Just slightly. Just by 2 beats per minute. Marcus allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "Well," he murmured to the empty room. "That's interesting." Clara Bennett walked down the long, echoing corridor of the executive wing, and she did not cry. She never cried at work. She saved that for the small apartment she rented in a walk-up building on the other side of the city where her cat, Muffin, waited for her and did not care that she was overweight or overlooked or spoken to, like she was less than dust. Her best friend Ivy was waiting for her by the nurse's station. Ivy was small and sharp-featured, with a pixie cut dyed a defiant shade of pink, and she had the loudest opinions of anyone Clara had ever met. "What did the ice witch say this time?" Ivy demanded, the moment Clara was in earshot. "Nothing," Clara said. "Nothing new, Clara. She called me the help." She threw a flower on the floor. "It's fine, Ivy, truly." "Sax." Ivy's small face darkened like a storm cloud. "One of these days that woman is going to say the wrong thing to the wrong person, and I hope I'm there to see it." Clara smiled, faintly. "Please don't punch her, Ivy. I don't want to have to bail you out, no promises." Clara laughed, and the sound was a little wet, a little raw. But it was a laugh. Ivy squeezed her arm. "Listen, tonight. You, me, dinner, that new Italian place on Bellwether Street. I already made the reservation. Ivy, I can't afford. My treat. And before you argue, I got a bonus, and if you make me eat cannolis alone, I will simply die. 7 o'clock. Wear the green dress, the one that makes your eyes look enormous." Clara wanted to protest. She always wanted to protest. But something about this morning, about the peony on the floor, about the way Victoria's voice had cut, made her nod. "All right," she said. 7 o'clock. Ivy beamed. Then, in her usual way, she leaned in and lowered her voice. "By the way, have you noticed anything strange about that patient of yours?" Clara blinked. "Mr. Vance, what do you mean?" "I mean in the 4 months he's been here, no member of hospital staff has been allowed near him, except you. Not one. Not the senior doctors, not the head of oncology, not even the hospital director. Just you. A junior nurse. That's because Dr. Ellison is his personal physician. He handles all the medical decisions. I just do the routine care, Clara. Ivy stared at her. Julian Vance owns half this city. He owns this hospital. His fiancée is one of the most vicious women in the state. And out of every nurse in this building, they chose you. Doesn't that seem, I don't know, a little strange? Clara had, in fact, thought about this. She had thought about it many times, in the quiet hours of her shifts, sitting beside a sleeping man who could buy the world twice over. But every time she thought about it, she reached the same conclusion. It was because she was invisible. Because she was safe, because she was the sort of woman no one would ever suspect of anything at all. I think, Clara said carefully, that I was chosen precisely because I don't matter to anyone. Ivy looked at her for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, Clara, I don't think that's true. That evening, Clara did wear the green dress. It was her favorite, though she rarely had reason to wear it. It hugged her broad shoulders and wide waist, and the generous curve of her hips and the deep emerald color made her hazel eyes look, as Ivy had promised, enormous. She met Ivy at the restaurant at 7. It was a beautiful place, all warm brick and candlelight and small round tables. And Clara felt, for a moment, almost pretty. They were seated at a lovely table by the window. They ordered wine. They laughed about ridiculous things. Ivy told a story about a doctor who had walked into a glass door, and Clara laughed so hard, her eyes watered. And then the front door of the restaurant opened, and in swept Victoria Kensington on the arm of a young man Clara vaguely recognized from a society magazine. Behind them trailed a small entourage of similarly polished friends. Clara's stomach dropped. Ivy followed her gaze. Oh, for the love of... It's fine, Clara whispered. She probably won't even see me. But Victoria did see her. Of course she did. Victoria Kensington had the radar of a hawk for anyone she considered less than herself. She crossed the restaurant with slow, deliberate steps, her entourage trailing behind her like a small glittering court. She stopped at Clara's table. Well, well, her voice carried. It was meant to carry. Look who's out for a nice meal. My fiancée's little nurse. The nearby tables went quiet. Faces turned. Ivy started to rise. Listen, you, Ivy, don't. Clara touched her friend's wrist gently. Please. Victoria smiled, and it was a cold, glittering thing. How can you afford a place like this, on a nurse's salary, sweetheart? Is my future husband's family paying you extra for something? A little side business, perhaps? The insinuation was unmistakable. Around them someone gasped. Someone else laughed. A nervous, ugly sound. Clara's face burned. Her hands began to tremble in her lap. I'm just having dinner with my friend, Miss Kensington, are you? Victoria tilted her head. Because from here, it looks like you're trying very hard to eat above your station. Look at you. That dress. That figure. Did you really think you belonged in a place like this? Enough. Victoria's boyfriend of the evening, a slim, sneering man in a tailored jacket, stepped forward. He picked up Clara's glass of wine from the table. Slowly, deliberately. And he poured it, dark red and cold, straight down the front of Clara's green dress. There were audible gasps now. The room was frozen. Clara sat stunned, as the wine soaked into the emerald fabric and dripped onto her lap. Victoria laughed. That terrible, thin laugh. Oh dear, she said, how clumsy. Now the dress matches the girl. A complete disaster. The tears came. They welled up hot and fast, and she pressed her napkin to her chest with shaking hands. Ivy was on her feet, shouting something, but Clara could not hear the words. There was a roaring in her ears. She was going to stand up. She was going to walk out. She was going to hold her head high and— "That is quite enough." The voice was low, measured, utterly, terrifyingly calm. Every head in the restaurant turned. A man stood in the doorway of the restaurant. He was tall and lean and dressed in an impeccably cut black suit. His hair was dark, his face all sharp planes, and his eyes were the color of storm-dark ocean water. Behind him stood two men in identical dark suits, and behind them stood a third, older man with silver at his temples, whom Clara distantly recognized as Marcus Cole. But her eyes were on the man in the doorway. Because it was impossible. It was completely impossible. Julian Vance was awake. Julian Vance was standing. Julian Vance was here. And Julian Vance was at this moment looking at Victoria Kensington with an expression that could have frozen the sun. Victoria's face drained of color. "Julian, darling. I have been awake," Julian said quietly, "for 6 hours. Long enough." He walked into the restaurant. His stride was even unhurried, as if he had not spent the last 4 months in a hospital bed. He passed Victoria without a glance. He passed her sneering boyfriend without a glance. He walked directly to Clara's table. Clara stared up at him, wine soaking through her dress, tears drying on her cheeks. She could not breathe. Julian looked down at her. And, in a gesture so small and so tender that later she would wonder if she had imagined it, he removed his black suit jacket and draped it, with careful hands, around her shoulders. "Miss Bennet," he said. His voice was low. "I apologize. This should not have happened." "You," Clara whispered, "you know my name." His mouth curved. "Just slightly. Just a fraction." "I know your name," he said. Then he turned, and the temperature of the room dropped 10 degrees. "Miss Kensington," Julian said without looking at her, "the engagement is terminated, effective this moment, and my legal team will contact your father in the morning regarding the transfer of the assets you have illegally moved during my convalescence." "What? Julian, what are you talking about? I didn't." Marcus Cole stepped forward, smooth as oil, and held out a slim leather folder. Victoria stared at it as if it were a snake. "Wire transfers," Marcus said pleasantly. "Falsified board resolutions. A rather clumsy attempt to sell shares of Vance Industries to your father's holding company at a fraction of their value. All while your fiancée was, as you put it earlier today, a body in a bed. We have been documenting for 4 months. It is a very thick folder." Victoria's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "And the young gentleman," Julian said, turning his cold gaze on the boyfriend, "who assaulted Miss Bennet will be arrested outside this restaurant in approximately 90 seconds. The police are already in the parking lot." The boyfriend went white as milk. You can't do that." "I can," Julian said. "And I have." He turned back to Clara. His face changed. It did not become warm, exactly. Julian Vance did not do warm. But it softened at the edges, in a way that Clara felt more than saw. "Miss Bennet," he said, "would you and your friend allow me to take you home? I owe you a great many explanations, but I do not think this restaurant is the place for them." Clara nodded mutely. She could not have spoken if her life depended on it. Julian offered her his arm. Ha! It was the arm of the most powerful man in the state, and it was offered to a chubby nurse in a wine-stained green dress, and every eye in the restaurant watched as Clara Bennet took it. Behind them, Victoria Kensington was still standing, frozen by the table, watching her entire life burn down in real time. The ride home was quiet. Clara sat in the back of a long black car, wrapped in Julian's jacket, which smelled of cedar and something else, something clean and expensive and warm. Ivy sat beside her, uncharacteristically silent, her small hand clutching Clara's larger one. Julian sat across from them, his storm-dark eyes fixed on Clara's face, not with hunger, not with pity, but with something quieter, something patient. "You said," Clara finally whispered, "that you had been awake for 6 hours." "Yes, but the machines." "The monitor, Dr. Ellison." "Dr. Ellison works for me," Julian said simply. "I woke this morning at 9:17. I asked to remain unmonitored for a short period. I needed to observe." "Observe what?" His eyes did not leave hers. "Everything." Clara's face burned. She thought of every silly thing she had ever said to him in that hospital room. Every whispered good morning. Every remark about the weather. Every peony. "Oh God," she whispered. "You heard everything." "I heard everything, Miss Bennet," Julian said quietly. "Every word." The car pulled up in front of Clara's small building. Julian's driver came around to open the door. Julian stepped out first and offered his hand to help Clara down. She took it, feeling the strange warmth of his palm, and then she stood on the cracked sidewalk of her ordinary street, in her ruined green dress, and she looked up at him. "Miss Bennet," Julian said, "I would like to call on you tomorrow." "If I may, call on me," she repeated, foolishly. "To explain everything. If you are willing to hear it." She should have said no. Any sensible woman would have said no. But Clara had spent 4 months talking to this man, in the quiet of a hospital room, and now he was standing in front of her, real and alive and awake, and looking at her as if she were the only person in the world. "Yes," she whispered. "All right." The next morning, at precisely 10 o'clock, a black car pulled up in front of Clara's building. Julian Vance stepped out, dressed once again in a dark, immaculate suit, and Clara, watching from her window with Ivy hovering behind her in a panic, thought her heart might beat right out of her chest. He carried a small bouquet of peonies. "Oh my God," Ivy hissed. "Oh my God." "Clara, oh my God." "Ivy, stop. I am going to hide in the bathroom and eavesdrop shamelessly, and you cannot stop me." Julian was shown into Clara's small, cluttered living room. Lettered? He looked, she thought, absurdly out of place among her second-hand furniture and her overflowing bookshelves, and Muffin the cat, who was watching him from the top of the couch with deep suspicion. He handed her the peonies. She took them, her hands trembling. "May I sit?" he asked. "Yes, please, of course." He sat on her small sofa. She sat across from him in her armchair. Muffin treacherously jumped onto Julian's lap. Julian, without missing a beat, began to gently scratch the cat behind the ears. "Miss Bennet," he began. "Clara, please." "Clara." His mouth softened just slightly around her name. "I owe you an explanation, and I would like to give it to you clearly, and without any evasion. May I?" She nodded. He took a slow breath. And then, in that same quiet, measured voice, he told her. He told her that they had met 3 years ago. She had not remembered it, because it had been a small moment, in a small florist's shop, on the corner of Maple and 6th, where she had worked before nursing school. He had come in the rain to buy flowers for his mother's grave. He had been curt and distracted, and grieving, and he had thrown the exact change on the counter without looking at her. And she had looked at him, this cold, hard stranger, and she had said softly, "I'm so sorry for your loss." Peonies were her favorite, weren't they? The way you're looking at them?" He had looked up. He had truly looked at her for the first time. And he had seen her. "I had spent a decade," Julian said quietly, "surrounded by people who saw only my name, my money, my power. You saw a man who was sad, and you told me you were sorry." He had not forgotten her. He had, over the following 3 years, quietly kept track of her. When she had gone to nursing school, he had, anonymously, paid the balance of her tuition after her scholarship. When she had struggled to find a placement, a position had mysteriously opened up at Vance Memorial Hospital. When his own accident had happened, and he had needed a nurse, he had asked for her by name. "You," Clara's voice cracked. "You watched over me for 3 years, and I didn't know." "I did not want you to know," Julian said. "Not until I was certain of my own feelings, and not until I was certain that you were safe from what my life brings." "But you were engaged to Victoria. An arrangement, a political marriage negotiated by my late father before his death, to secure a merger. I had intended to break it, and then the accident happened. And Victoria used my convalescence to make her move." "The accident wasn't an accident, was it?" Clara whispered. Julian's dark eyes flickered. "No, it was not. Victoria's father, Richard Kensington, arranged it. He believed that if I died, and Victoria was my grieving fiancée, he would inherit a controlling share of my company. He miscalculated." "How?" "He assumed I would die. I did not, and he assumed that, while I slept, no one would be watching. But Marcus was watching. So, in her own way, were you." "Me? What did I do?" "You loved me, Clara," Julian said quietly. "You did not know it. You would have denied it if I had asked you. But you loved me every morning with flowers, with soft words, with a hand on my forehead when the fever came. You loved me when I was worth nothing to you, when I could give you nothing, when I was a body in a bed." Clara's tears spilled over. She could not stop them. "And I," Julian said more quietly still, "loved you from that day in the florist's shop. Every day since Muffin the cat purred loudly on his lap. It was, Clara thought helplessly, the most ridiculous moment of her entire life. "I don't," she whispered. "I don't understand what you want, Julian, what you want from me." He set the cat gently aside. He rose from the sofa. And then, in a movement that made Clara's heart stop entirely, Julian Vance knelt on the worn carpet of her tiny living room and took her trembling hand in both of his. "I want everything, Clara," he said. "I want to court you properly. I want to know your favorite books, and your worst jokes, and what you look like in the morning when you have not yet put your hair up. I want to bring you flowers every week for the rest of my life. I want, when you are ready, to marry you. Scatting, match, buy. Not tomorrow, not this year, if you do not wish, but some day. When you are certain, when you have chosen me freely and not because you feel obligated. Julian, but I need you to know this now, and clearly. There is no ambiguity in my feelings. There has not been for 3 years. You are the woman I love. You are the woman I intend to build my life around. And I will wait, however long you need, for you to decide if you can love me back." There was a long silence. From the bathroom, Clara could distinctly hear Ivy sob, once, loudly. Clara looked down at the man kneeling before her. This powerful, terrifying, quiet man who had loved her, in secret, for 3 years. This man who had spoken to her only in monosyllables in a florist shop, and had apparently remembered every word she said, and she thought with the clarity of morning that she had loved him too. She had loved him in the quiet hours beside his bed. She had loved him without knowing what to call it. She had loved him when she thought he could not hear her. She lifted her free hand. She placed it, very gently, against his cheek. "I don't need to wait," she whispered. "Julian, I don't need to wait at all." He closed his eyes. The great and terrible Julian Vance, master of empires, closed his storm-dark eyes and pressed his cheek into her plump, warm palm, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. From the bathroom came a second, louder sob. "Ivy," Clara called, without looking away from him. "You can come out now." The following weeks were, for Clara, a strange and beautiful dream. Julian courted her, exactly as he had promised, and with a quiet devotion that never wavered. He brought peonies every Sunday. He picked her up from her shifts at the hospital, in a way that made every other nurse on the floor whisper for days. He took her to dinners at quiet restaurants, where the waiters seemed to know Clara's name before she said it. He introduced her to his mother's grave, and stood beside her, while she laid peonies on the stone, and did not speak for a long time after. He also, without fanfare, dismantled Richard Kensington's entire criminal enterprise. It happened over the course of 8 days. Companies were bought, assets were seized. Federal agents tipped anonymously arrived at the Kensington estate with warrants. Victoria's engagement to Julian was formally annulled, and Victoria herself, when Clara last heard of her, had fled to a small property in Europe to escape the scandal. Marcus Cole handled the details with quiet satisfaction. He also, on more than one occasion, and to Clara's slow-growing amusement, teased his boss mercilessly. "You realize," Marcus said one afternoon in Julian's office while Clara sat on the leather sofa reading a book, "that in 3 years I have watched you buy an entire chain of florist shops, so that this woman would always have peonies in stock in her city. I have watched you root a highway construction project so that her commute would be shorter. I have watched you, in the last month, personally review the security footage of her apartment building every single night. And you have the nerve, sir, to call yourself subtle." Julian, at his desk, did not look up from his papers. It was efficient. It was insane. It was efficient, Marcus. Clara, curled on the sofa, laughed softly, and Julian's eyes flickered up to her and softened. She was not, she found, insecure with him. Not the way she had been all her life. When Julian looked at her, he looked at her whole and entire, and did not seem to see anything he wanted changed. He kissed her, when he first kissed her, with such patient reverence that she had cried, and he had held her and had said very quietly, "Never, never again, Clara, will anyone make you feel small." She believed him. And then, 6 weeks after the restaurant, the last of the Kensington faction made their move. Clara was leaving the hospital after a late shift. She had told Julian's driver not to wait for her that night, because Ivy had promised to pick her up, and Ivy was, as always, running 15 minutes late. Clara walked out into the parking lot alone, in her scrubs, in the dark. The van came out of nowhere. She had time only to feel the arms around her waist, and to smell the sharp chemical scent of the cloth pressed against her face, and to think, absurdly, that she had not told Julian she loved him that morning. And then the world went black, when Julian's phone rang at 11:43 that night, and Marcus's voice on the other end said, quietly, "She has been taken." Something in Julian Vance's face changed forever. He rose from his desk. He walked slowly to the great glass window that overlooked the city, and he looked down at the lights, at all the small lights of all the small lives beneath him. And he said, in a voice like tempered steel, "Black protocol, now." Marcus did not ask if he was sure. Marcus had been waiting for 4 months to hear those words. Within 20 minutes, every asset of the Vance empire was mobilized. Every private security team, every intelligence contractor, Every favor called in 1,000 different corners of the city and the country. Every camera, every satellite, every whisper. Within 40 minutes, the van had been identified. Within an hour, its route had been reconstructed. Within 90 minutes, its destination had been narrowed to a warehouse on the industrial waterfront. Julian arrived at that warehouse at 1:17 in the morning, in a long black car, wearing the same black suit he had worn to Clara's apartment 6 weeks earlier. He did not carry a weapon. He did not need to. Behind him in the shadow of the loading dock were 60 of his men, armed, disciplined, silent. Inside the warehouse, Clara Bennett had woken tied to a chair. Her head ached fiercely, her mouth was dry. But her heart, strangely, was calm. Across from her, pacing in a tailored suit that was too clean for the setting, was Richard Kensington himself. Victoria's father, the hidden architect. "You," he was muttering, "you. A nurse, a fat little nurse. Do you understand what you have cost me?" "I understand," Clara said quietly, "that you attempted to kill a good man for money, and that you failed. I understand that quite clearly." He struck her across the face. Her head snapped sideways. She tasted blood, but she did not cry. Instead, she smiled. A small, quiet, terrifying smile that she had not known she was capable of. "You should not have done that, Mr. Kensington," she said softly. "He is going to be so very angry when he finds out." Richard Kensington laughed. "He does not even know you are missing, girl. And even if he did—" The lights in the warehouse went out. Every light, all at once. And in the sudden darkness, Clara heard, from somewhere, very close, a low voice. She would have known, anywhere, in the world. "I know," Julian Vance said. What happened next, Clara would only ever half remember. There was the sound of doors being breached, there were shouts, quickly silenced. There was the soft, controlled crack of gunfire, precise and brief. There was Richard Kensington, screaming something incoherent, and then falling silent. And then there were hands on her, gentle hands, cutting the ropes at her wrists, cupping her bruised face with such tender care that she thought she would break apart. The lights came back on. Julian was kneeling in front of her, and his face, that impossibly calm and terrifying face, was wet with tears. Clara had not, in 6 weeks, seen him cry. "Clara," he said. His voice broke on her name. "Clara! I am so sorry." "It's all right," she whispered. She lifted her hand, still shaking, and wiped his tears with her thumb. "You came. You came. Julian, that's all that matters." Behind him, Marcus Cole stood quietly with his hands folded, and there was, on his face, an expression of such deep relief that Clara realized, with a small shock, that Marcus loved her too, in his own way. As family, Richard Kensington was on his knees in the corner, held by 2 of Julian's men. His face was ashen. Julian rose. He turned, and he walked, slowly, to face the man who had ordered his death, who had orchestrated 4 months of theft, who had tonight put his hands on Clara. "Mr. Kensington," Julian said quietly, "everything you own now belongs to me. Every share, every property, every account, it has already been signed over. My lawyers were very efficient tonight. You will be handed to federal authorities in approximately 15 minutes. You will spend the rest of your life in prison, and you will die there. Do you understand?" Kensington could not speak. "Do you understand?" Julian said again. Kensington nodded mutely. "Good." Julian turned his back on him as if he no longer existed and went back to Clara. He knelt again. He took both her hands in his. "Come," he said softly, "let's go home." 6 months later, on a warm evening in early summer, The Vance Memorial Hospital held a small, quiet ceremony in the newly renovated West Wing. The wing had been redesigned as a free clinic for the uninsured of the city. Above its front doors, in tasteful bronze letters, was carved a name: the Clara Bennett Foundation. Clara stood in the front row of the small crowd, wearing a soft cream dress that had been tailored perfectly to her body. Ivy, beside her, was openly weeping into a handkerchief. Marcus Cole, in a dark suit, stood behind them with an expression that could almost be called warm. Julian stood at the small podium. He was, as always, impeccable in black. But there was something different about him now. Something Clara alone could always see. His shoulders were not so tight. His eyes were not so guarded. When he looked at her, in the front row, his whole face changed. 6 months ago, Julian said into the microphone, I woke from a long sleep. I woke because a woman had spent 4 months speaking to me, softly, when no one else remembered I was there. I woke because she brought me flowers. Because she told me about the weather, because she treated the body of a stranger with the same tenderness she would have shown a beloved brother. I woke because Clara Bennett, in her quiet, extraordinary kindness, refused to let me disappear. Clara's eyes filled. This foundation, Julian continued, is a small acknowledgement of what she taught me. That true power is not measured in what one can take. It is measured in what one chooses to give, and in what one chooses to protect. He paused. He looked directly at her. Clara, would you come up here, please? Ivy shoved her gently. Clara walked on unsteady legs, up the small set of steps, and onto the platform. Julian took her hand. And then, in front of 200 assembled guests, in front of every reporter in the city, in front of the entire staff of the hospital that had once called her only his nurse, Julian Vance dropped to one knee. The crowd gasped as one. Clara Bennett, he said quietly, though the microphone caught every word. 6 months ago, in your small living room, on a worn carpet, with a cat on my lap, I told you that I intended to marry you. I told you I would wait as long as you needed. It has been 6 months. And every day I have loved you more than the day before. And every day I have watched you become more sure of yourself, more sure of your own worth, more sure of the woman you have always been. You are ready. Now, and so am I. He drew a small velvet box from his jacket. He opened it. Inside was a single ring, elegant and simple. A large, clear stone, flanked by 2 small peonies carved in white gold. Clara, will you marry me? Clara laughed. Bia, ass, dower, laughed. Lacklas. She laughed and she cried. All at the same time, and she nodded. So many times, she thought her head might come loose. And she whispered, Yes, yes, Julian, yes. He rose. He slid the ring onto her finger. Shh. And then, in front of everyone, he kissed her, and the world erupted in applause. From somewhere in the crowd, Ivy screamed, That's my best friend. Marcus Cole, standing behind her, muttered dryly, About time. And Clara Bennett, standing in the arms of the most powerful man in the state, in a dress that fit her body perfectly, with a ring on her finger and a foundation carved with her name over the door behind her, understood, at last, that she had never been invisible. She had only been waiting to be seen by the right pair of eyes. They were married in the autumn, in a small ceremony attended only by those who mattered. Ivy was the maid of honor. Marcus was the best man. Muffin the cat, in a tiny bow tie, was carried down the aisle by a nervous flower girl. The hospital staff, who had once whispered about the chubby nurse who spoke to the sleeping billionaire, attended in their best clothes and cried openly. Clara wore a gown of ivory silk, and her curves were not hidden but celebrated. Her round face glowed, her double chin dimpled with joy, her heavy arms carried a bouquet of peonies. Julian, at the altar, watched her walk toward him, and there was on his face an expression that no photograph would ever quite capture. It was the expression of a man who had at last come home. They spoke their vows quietly, just to each other, and later, when asked, neither of them could remember the exact words. What Clara remembered was his hand in hers. What Julian remembered was her smile. They lived, afterwards, in a large house on a quiet street, with 3 cats and a garden full of peonies. Clara did not stop nursing. She could not have been persuaded to. She worked at her foundation clinic 3 days a week, treating the people the city had forgotten, the way she herself had once been forgotten. Julian sometimes drove her in the morning, and he sometimes waited outside in the car until her shift ended, and Marcus teased him relentlessly about this. But Julian did not care. He had learned from her what his power was for. It was for this: for loving one good woman with the whole of his terrible heart, for protecting the small, kind, quiet lives that made the world worth living in, for seeing, always, the ones the world refused to see. And Clara, in turn, had learned that she had never been ordinary at all. She had been extraordinary all along. She had only needed one man, in a florist's shop, 3 years earlier, to look up at the right moment, and truly see her. The rest, as they say, was history. First. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Clara would sit on the porch of their home with Julian beside her, and she would watch the sun set over the garden of peonies, and she would think about the woman she had once been. The woman who had cried on the way home from work, the woman who had believed she did not matter, the woman who had thought a wine-stained green dress was the end of her dignity. And she would take her husband's hand in hers, and she would kiss his knuckles, softly, the way she had once kissed the forehead of a sleeping stranger, and she would whisper into the falling evening, "Good night, Julian." And Julian Vance, the silent king, who had once been so far from anyone at all, would answer her every single time, without fail, "Good night, my love, I hear you."